All right, so I am Brian Tashima. I am a co-lead of the program Autism Empowerment's Neurodivergent Creators Collective, and welcome to our September workshop. We are very privileged and honored to have as our special guest Meg Eden, who is a creative writing instructor and also an award-winning author. I think her latest book is Good Different, and she has a forthcoming title called The Girl in the Wall, coming out. When is it coming out this year, Meg?
It just came out, so I probably gave you an
Just
old
came out.
bio. Yeah.
There you go. She is also the author of a book called Post-High School Reality Quest, which after I finished reading it, I said out loud, man, I wish I had written that book. Which, as an author, to me, is like the highest form of praise you can give to another author. So it was, I love that one. So yeah, so we're really lucky to have her with us today. And so yeah, take it away, Meg.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. And welcome everyone. So I'm really excited today to talk about video games and writing. So to be clear, I don't write for video games. I write inspired by video games. I speak at panels at events like the Music and Gaming Festival, MagFest. And I'm really interested in what we can learn as writers about how games work and what they do well, as a way to think about storytelling from a new angle. So learning to write from video games. So the more that I consume mediums besides books, because I'm a writer, as Brian said, so I read books. But when I'm looking at movies, when I'm looking at video games, when I'm looking at all these different mediums, I'm really interested that there's more than one way to tell a story. If you are a writer and maybe you've taken creative writing classes, there's lots of ways that we're often told how to write a story. And what interests me is that that's not necessarily fully true. There's some ways that are really great for written mediums, but there's also all these different creative ways we can tell stories and all these different tools we can use. Has anyone heard the maxim show don't tell? Is that something anyone's heard? Okay, I'm seeing a couple nods and thumbs up. Yeah, and so there's truth and power to that phrase. But maybe it's and there's some ways that we can interestingly look at that through video games. And in fact, in video games, I've heard maybe they even say, uh, "Don't show or don't tell, but let us do." And I think that's what showing kind of is. It's allowing the reader, or in the case of video games, the player to be a participant. Another way to think about it too is to show more, tell less. The telling is not necessarily bad, but the more that we allow a reader or a player to be an active participant in the story, the more they own it, the more interesting and engaging it is. So today, that's what we're going to really talk about. And we're going to talk about it particularly through the idea of objects and what we'll talk about what objects are, how we can use those on the page, how those are used in games. And so I'd be curious, feel free to share in the chat what your background is, what your interest is with this topic. Do you write short stories or novels? Are you interested in video games? Are games a brand new thing to you? Because my hope is what we talk about are really storytelling devices in general. So regardless of what kind of stories you want to tell, however you want to tell them, these principles will apply. But I would like to hear from you. Feel free to share maybe where you're coming from. But while you're doing that, let me talk a little bit more about this idea of objects, because that's why I said we're going to really focus on today. The ultimate shower is an object. And so when I was in graduate school for poetry, my professor kept telling me, you can cut off the ending of your poems, like cut off the end because you're basically explaining the poem. You finish the poem and now you're explaining to the reader what they should think, what the poem means. And I'm not trusting the reader. That's what he kept saying. And he'd tell me to end it instead on an object or an image. And he quoted Ezra Pound, who's a questionable dude, so I'm not necessarily promoting Ezra Pound, but I think this is a great quote from him, that the natural object is always the adequate symbol. And my professor would say this over and over again, and I was thinking, well, what on earth does this mean, the natural object? And we're all here neurodivergent. I'm autistic, and so I'm thinking like literally, what does that mean? Because I do tend to take things literally. But what I started to understand, especially as I watched video games, is that games, especially if you've heard of like walking simulators, which we'll talk a little bit more later, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek term, but this idea of a game where really you're exploring a space. Really, those objects do so much work telling the natural object, those objects we naturally encounter while playing a video game, are the adequate symbol. So they do the work. They are adequate over an explanation, is really what my professor was telling me. And it took video games for that kind of concept to click, that when we give a sensory detail or an object to a player or to a reader, instead of that exposition or with less exposition and explanation, that's going to stick stronger for a reader. It's going to be more compelling. Instead of giving an abstraction, we're grounding emotion, meaning, and description into objects because we can understand objects. They're tangible, they're concrete, instead of something that maybe is a little too loosey-goosey to understand. And in video games, this is described often as environmental storytelling. So how can the environment, how can the objects in space around us tell a story? So let me just check the chat real quick because I saw a couple things. Okay, great. So, cool. So we've got some poets in the room too. So, I didn't mention, I kind of implied there, but my background's in poetry. I have an MFA, and I write poems too. And in fact, the books that Brian mentioned, my latest ones, are novels in verse with autistic protagonists. So, I love seeing that we've got a range there. We've got fiction writers, nonfiction poetry, and actors too. Fantastic. Cool. So we've got quite a range there. And before I forget as well, I'm gonna re-put in the chat. There's a handout and there's a script, and I believe they're going to be on the website as well soon. Okay, so so I kind of explained what the natural object means, what the natural object is always the adequate symbol means, this term for today of environmental storytelling. And so now let's put that into action. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to play the first 10 minutes or so of this video game called Gone Home. And what I want you to do is, while we're playing this, write down a list. And so you can kind of think of it in two columns or however you want to, but columns might be helpful. In the first column, you're writing down all the objects we're encountering. And then next to those objects, what narrative information do we get? What do we learn about the space or the people that are in it based on the objects? So for example, if I see moving boxes, I'm going to think, well, somebody just moved in or somebody's moving out. So does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, let's get started then. So feel free to share in the chat or either by unmuting, what are some of the objects you encountered and the information those objects gave you? Okay, so we see a painting, like a family portrait, and so that tells us that a family lives there. Fantastic. Exactly. What else? What are some other things that we've encountered?
Somebody is an author.
Yeah, so what told us that there was somebody that was an author?
The magazine.
Yes, yeah, so there's the Stephen King writing magazine. Yeah, absolutely. Love that.
And somebody works for the Forestry Service from the jacket in the closet with the badge on it.
Oh, I love that. Yes, so somebody works at the Forestry Service. Absolutely.
And the note told us that the older sister has been gone for a year.
Great. So we know that the person walking in, or the older sister, maybe this is a new environment then. They've been gone for a long time. Yeah, great point. And so I'm noticing some in the chat too. So we've got the backpack, shows or tells us that there's been moving or travel. The note on the door implies that they don't plan on coming back. Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah. An answering machine implies the older sister's coming back to town. Absolutely. There were a few papers that tell us about this family, that this family is wondering where the daughter or sister is. Yes. And there's use of older technology. Yeah, there's the answering machine. And if you look around later, you'll see phone books. And so that's really great world building and time setting. So if you work speculative work or historical work, thinking about how those objects can do that world building for you really efficiently is really great. Instead of telling us, oh, it's 1992, why not have objects that really place us in 1992 so we can use that energy for the story? Oh, and there was a board game. Yeah, so interesting. Princeton, feel free to mention what maybe you get from that object. To me, that says that maybe people are around in the house somewhat enough to like play board games, but maybe not fully moved in yet because there's still a lot of boxes. Great. So you guys did exactly what I was hoping. Did this make sense? Did anybody have any questions about this exercise? Isn't it wild that we only played 6 minutes? And there was some auditory tracks there, but even without that, how much we learned in such a small amount of time about this family. I think that really blew my mind the first time I saw games like this. I went, wow, you can do so much work in such a little bit of time. And that really inspires me as a storyteller of how can I do similarly. So hopefully I'm persuading you a bit of what, like that environmental storytelling works, but why? Why does this work? And there's a few reasons. And the first is that it's efficient. So it doesn't need explanations. It really keeps things simple and focused because ultimately as storytellers, there's a main thing we're trying to do. We want to keep the main thing. And sometimes we can lose the plot, as it said, getting caught up in details that really aren't the point of the story. Maybe we feel like we have to have lots of backstory or lots of exposition to persuade you to want to read this story. But often making things more complicated makes it less compelling. And in fact, I was just going to play this quick clip from this gamer Brutal Moose as he reviews this really goofy bootleg kind of game off of Oregon Trail. Does anyone remember the Oregon Trail games? Yeah, so there's this Amazon Trail 2 game that apparently was trying to get the edutainment market, but he briefly tries to explain the plot of this game. And it makes me laugh because I think as a storyteller, I've done this of where I've like overcomplicated it instead of kind of keeping it simple, keeping it focused. So we'll hear from him. So I love that because I know I've written stories where I've thought people won't want to read this unless I have this happening and this happening and this. And so often what compels us is just doing the simple stuff effectively. And so that's what I really love about environmental storytelling is that when it's done well, it's efficient, it keeps things simple, it keeps things focused, it keeps us as storytellers on track of what is it that we're really trying to convey. And I think that's something so critical that we should constantly remind ourselves when we're creating work is what's the thing I'm trying to say? What's the thing I'm trying to do? Because there's so many possibilities and it's so easy to get caught up in the weeds. So I know I'm constantly reminding myself, like, what's that one big thing I want to do in this piece? So it's efficient. And also I kind of implied this earlier, but it allows the reader or the player to be an active participant by filling in these gaps and contributing to a story. So when we're not explaining everything, when we're not tying everything up perfectly, it's going to linger and haunt our readers a bit. They're going to have to try to build their own connections to understand what's happening a little bit. And that really makes them contribute to the story. So if we give just those breadcrumbs and we make them have to fill it in, that's going to make them invested and it's going to make it more compelling. It's going to let them feel like they're with that character, making aha moments. So I don't know if anyone is a mystery fan, but I know I grew up with Poirot mysteries. Has anyone ever watched or read those? Yeah. So I love that. Like I love watching them, but I would always get frustrated in that it felt like Poirot was always 5 steps ahead of me. So he would say, I figured it all out. And he'd put all this stuff together and I'd go, wait, I didn't get to be a part of that. I'm not, I don't have as many of the little gray cells as Poirot does. And so I think I appreciated maybe more the more recent Sherlock, where it felt like they gave you a little bit more of those breadcrumbs to be in his thought process and kind of solve it alongside with him. And so I think as writers, I try to encourage us of can we build enough of that in for the reader to follow along. So we aren't Poirot going 10 steps ahead of them, but hopefully we're letting them join alongside, whether it's a mystery or not, that they're getting to put things together. Because ultimately readers are smart and they can figure out a lot of this stuff. I particularly stress that because I write for children, and often people think like, oh, the kids are dumb. We got to explain everything to them. We got to hold their hands. No, kids are smart. So if you're writing for kids or adults, any age, readers are smart. And, you know, we should give them some credit where credit is due, that they can put some pieces together. And so, like I said, this makes us more invested. When we have to fill it in and be participants, it's going to make us ask questions. We're going to have to impose some elements of our experience and knowledge. We're going to feel that tension. It's going to let a story stick with a reader long after they're finished. Because I think as creators, we're thinking, well, how can we make something that's compelling that somebody's going to think about it afterwards? And so I think using the natural object, using environmental storytelling, this is a great way that we can create work that is going to stick with those readers and those viewers and players. It's going to make them connect with those characters and situations more. It's going to make it memorable because it's activating multiple parts of the brain. The different senses are in different parts of our brain. So, you know, the more we're activating that, the more that this is going to make it memorable. And I know when I'm thinking of my favorite stories, it's often those objects that really embody things. So, Great Expectations is one of my favorite stories by Charles Dickens. And there's that creepy Miss Havisham, who's heartbreaking. Creepy, I guess, maybe makes it sound negative, but more heartbreaking and sad that she's had this loss. And so she has all these objects. She kind of freezes her life from her wedding day and she doesn't move forward. That's how she grieves. And so those objects of her wearing the wedding gown everywhere, the room that's still set up as the wedding banquet, you know, decades later, those kind of sensory details, that's really what sticks with me. And so the other thing is that when we tell kind of stories with the personal aspects, when we're making it more personal, objects allow us to do this, but then that also makes it compelling for the viewer or the reader or the player because it's connecting to that deeper human experience. And since I'm talking about video games, I love mentioning that some of these beloved franchises like Legend of Zelda and Pokemon are perfect examples of this. So the Legend of Zelda, Miyamoto made those initial games inspired by his childhood playing in caves and exploring caves. So that's the experience he wanted to recreate. It's something that he knew intimately and personally, and he wanted to make that for kids and adults. And I think he captured that spirit, and I think it's part of why we continue going to Zelda games. And I'm a huge Pokemon fan. That's one of my special interests. And knowing Satoshi Tajiri was inspired by bug collecting as a kid, that's kind of the seed that started that. So he knew bug collecting, he loved that, and he captured that spirit in the game. And, you know, generations now love Pokemon and the idea of collecting that he captured through what he knew. And so writing and games, I think another thing they have in common is that they're acts of exploration and play. They're fueled, I think the best ones are fueled by memory and experience. And so I would encourage you as a storyteller to write what you know and to really dig deeply into the things you love, the things you know, the things you have experience with, the things you have special interests for, you know, really dig into that and celebrate that. Writing is a fantastic, perfect space. Really, storytelling in general, the perfect space for using those special interests and those things that you know deeply. And it's going to make it a better story for it. So that's why I think it matters, but how do we actually do this? So this is a great thing to talk about in theory, but how do we constructively do this? So there's all sorts of different ways, and you can feel free to share any ideas you have too, but here are a few that came to mind for me. And so I briefly touched on this one, but environmental storytelling can be used for context and backstory, especially if you're doing historical or speculative. And I know, especially with speculative, there's always this challenge of thinking, well, how do I create this brand new world and explain it to people without spending 30 pages, you know, just doing lore or just stopping the plot? to explain world building. And so I think video games are a really great example to look to as a mentor text for this, because games don't want to stop your play to explain things. So if you look at things like Dark Souls, they have these objects that you can find and that you can then you can take your time. If you're really into the lore, you can dig into those and look at the descriptions, or you can kind of keep going. So it allows for some options, but also those objects, of course, can do a lot of work. And then here, this is a screenshot from Until Dawn, which uses a tool that's common in video games of journals. And so again, in games, you have this option where the player can choose how kind of their experience of how much to slow down. And we don't necessarily get that if we're writing traditional stories. There's kind of this linear path. But what I think I've taken from that is that a little can go a long way. And so with Until Dawn, it's kind of this horror game, these kids that, there's a monster chasing them. And what I remember about this game, if you ask me to think of one thing I think of with this game, I think of this moment where this girl gets trapped underground. I want to say it was in these old mines. She finds this journal, and it's of a character she knows who is becoming the monster. And so there's all this information here, which can be valuable if you slow down. But what I really loved with it was what we could see through the object. So as she becomes a monster, the handwriting changes. And so it stops becoming as much of her and it becomes the monster that she's becoming. And so just visually, that conveyed a lot to me emotionally about what was happening in this moment. And so even if you don't take time to write literal journal entries, maybe you have a journal object that a character encounters and you can show really brief excerpts. That's something I did in The Girl on the Walls, where she finds a journal, and so she can, look at brief excerpts that give us pertinent information outside of that character's experience. Or like I said with that example, where visually what the journal handwriting looks like, what the journal object itself looks like, can go a long way in creating some context and backstory. Yes, okay, so I covered that. Great. So context and backstory is one way we can use environmental storytelling. Another way is raising the stakes. And so a question I like to ask is, what is the environment that would create the most stakes or the highest tension? So if there's an argument, is it more tense for the two characters to be alone in a room, in a house? Perhaps if one of them doesn't feel safe with the other, that raises a lot of tension. There's nowhere to go, perhaps. There's nobody to ask for help with. Or is it more tense if there's an argument or fight in the middle of the DMV where everyone can see and it's already an obnoxious place to be, or in the middle of Wawa? Depending on the situation and your characters, the environment can really be an opportunity to raise stakes and heightened tension. And I say this as is important, particularly because I know from my experience with publishing, something I'm always being asked, what are the stakes in the story? What's to be lost? And so it is important that even if we have a story that we think it's interesting, explaining to a reader or showing a reader why this is the end of the world if this thing goes wrong is really important. And so a game I think of that does this really well is Papers, Please, which, if you aren't familiar with, it's an unfortunately very timely game about being a border patrol agent in kind of this made up but Soviet-esque world, and you are making choices of who to allow into the country and who to not allow. And I think you could have that kind of choice where you're letting people in or letting them out. How do the stakes differ if that's a party, versus kind of a historic context between nations that we historically know is very tense. You could have that same kind of concept in multiple environments, but because of kind of the way it emulates a certain historic moment, it implies a lot of stakes that make it particularly compelling, I think. Environment can establish dissonance as well as context to fully appreciate why those stakes are so high. So that's something to think about for the stories you're telling. Where would this be most compelling that the environment can make it tense and make us understand why this really matters? Like for this, we really feel because of who we are and where we are that this is a life or death situation, whether we let people cross or not. And also, if you're not a gamer, but you're curious about this one, there is a Papers, Please mini movie on YouTube. So I highly recommend checking that out or watching a Let's Play. It's a really fantastic, compelling game. So then, kind of going on that stakes idea, there's a lot of different ways we can create tension with environmental storytelling and objects. And a few I wanted to highlight. One is the tension between where you can and can't go. Because I know when I'm playing a video game, uh, I might not, initially you tell me, oh, there's a cave. Do you want to go in? I'm like, ah, okay, like whatever. But then when I see that that cave is on the other side of water and I don't have the ability to swim, now suddenly I really want to go in that cave because I can't go there. So somehow, the way we're wired as humans, the tension of like you want to go somewhere because you can't go there. And I think this is a really compelling design technique in games that as soon as you can see that there's a place to go, but you can't get there yet, now you're really motivated. Like, okay, how do I figure out how to swim? How do I find a way there? And so as storytellers, we should learn from this technique that because I know I'm guilty of this, where I create an interesting idea for tension and then I immediately resolve it. And so it's kind of useless, right? It's kind of like this door being locked with a peephole, but then I instantly find the key, or it's not locked and I just go in. Then that peephole is kind of useless. There's no tension. So how can we create tension? How can we um, show what our character wants or a place they want to go, but create obstacles so they can't get there immediately? Then that lets our reader or player ruminate of like, oh, what's there? I want to go there. I want to find out what's there, and that's going to keep them turning the pages. This screenshot is from a game that called What Remains of Edith Finch, which is a game with a house with lots of locked doors. And so you can initially look through these peepholes to see what's in the other side of the door. And what's interesting is it's a story about generations, it's a story about family and grief and all these really interesting ideas. And each of the rooms is a character's room. And so each of those rooms can tell us something about that person. But it's interesting if you look through a peephole because you can only see some of it and it's distorted, right? So you can't fully appreciate what's there yet, but now you want to. And maybe you can start getting some clues of who these people might be. So that's another game I definitely recommend, What Remains of Edith Finch. So there's tension of where you can and can't go. There's also tension between past and present. And so this is not a video game. This is just a photo from an abandoned place in Japan. And I find urban exploration and abandoned places so fascinating because there's this tension between that previous state of glory and its current decay. There's a tension between the past and the present. And as a storyteller, I can't help but wonder, trying to fill in those gaps of how did we get from A to B? What happened? Because this doesn't seem to be the state it should be in. Something went wrong, right? There's maybe some clues of who used to be here. There's some clues of maybe why they're no longer here. So I'm wondering, why is it empty now? What was once here that we can no longer access? So that's another technique we can have in storytelling with tension. I've got a project I'm working on now where there wasn't much plot and I was trying to figure out what to do. And I realized one way I could create tension was through that past and present. So having not just the character in this immediate moment, but perhaps he's reminiscing about the past. So instead of telling us the story from it happening in that moment, what if instead he's looking back at it? Because now that can't be changed. We know there's an inevitability. It creates some tension as he's putting the story together for us. So that's something to think about if there's ways past and present can play in your story. And then finally, another way tension can be created is between characters. Maybe objects telling stories that they would not tell themselves, or the discovery of those objects being a linchpin for conflicts and arguments. So this is a screenshot from the game Life is Strange, which is a game about a girl who discovers she has powers to rewind time. And of course, when you're playing a video game, you have this kind of omniscience where you can walk into people's houses or rooms or look through their stuff, you smash their pots. And what's interesting with this game, when you do that, is you can go into this character Dana's room and you can rifle through her things, and you find things she would not just naturally hand over and tell you about. So you can find like a pregnancy test in her trash can, and when you do that, she comes in and sees you holding this and is like, "Why are you going through my trash, you weirdo?" And so it can escalate conflict. So this is an interesting thing I try to think about with my stories, especially if I need to ramp up tension of what could my character discover that maybe somebody would be trying to keep hidden? And how would that person respond when they realize that my character has found that object? And so, like I said, Dana would never tell us this information. So, what objects could do that instead? Because we have to, especially if we write in first person, if we tell a story through a single lens and perspective, that's going to be limited. So, they have to find information that they would need otherwise. And it would be inauthentic and obnoxious if we had a character come in and just expository tell us something that they would never naturally tell us. So thinking about how those objects organically might do that work and maybe be seeds for future conflict if your character maybe takes that object or messes that object up so it's obvious they were there. There's opportunities for cause and effect that way. So, in conclusion, with all that nonsense, because I want us to get to an activity and having conversation. With whatever story you're working on, I love to encourage you to consider how you might use the environment to heighten that story. What's the most interesting place that can take place, and how might that be able to create the most tension that's appropriate for the story you're trying to tell? Um, how would the story change if it happened in a different place? How would each scene change if they were in different places? Maybe if you're starting in a place and you're like, this thing's cool and I don't know how to talk about it, think about, well, why does this interest you? And dig into those objects and details and what might those tell you and how might that be a seed to launch you forward? But ultimately think like, what does this environment contribute? What can this environment do for you to maximize your story? So I want to invite us to with an exercise based on this poem, and it will be optional. I'll give you a few minutes, that you're welcome to do it if you want. But I love this poem, and I love this poem because it does what we've been talking about. Um, it's kind of like a video game walkthrough of a space, and it zooms into these objects. So reflect as I read through it, what these objects are doing and how Ted Kuzer kind of curates these objects to tell a story. So this is called Abandoned Farmhouse. He was a big man, says the size of his shoes on a pile of broken dishes by the house. A tall man, too, says the length of the bed in an upstairs room, and a good, God fearing man, says the Bible, with a broken back on the floor below the window, dusty with sun. But not a man for farming, say the fields cluttered with boulders and the leaky barn. A woman lived with him, says the bedroom wall papered with lilacs, and the kitchen shelves covered with oilcloth. And they had a child, says the sandbox made from a tractor tire. Money was scarce, say the jars of plum preserves and canned tomatoes sealed in a cellar hole. And the winter's cold, say the rags in the window frames. It was lonely here, says the narrow country road. Something went wrong, says the empty house in the weed-choked yard. Stones in the field say he was not a farmer. The still sealed jars in the cellar say she left in a nervous haste. And the child, its toys are strewn in the yard like branches after a storm. A rubber cow, a rusty tractor with a broken plow, a doll in overalls. Something went wrong, they say. So, we're a little short on time, but I would invite you, feel free if you have any thoughts or reflections on that poem to put them in the chat. But while you're thinking about that, I also want to invite the prompt. So I think this is cool how he walks through this space and he uses kind of a form. He says, the blank says blank. The walls say a woman lived here. Uh, the jars of plum preserve say money was scarce. The Bible says he feared God. Like, there's a kind of formula we can hijack here if helpful. But what I'd really like you to do is pick a space that's interesting to you. So maybe you're working on a story now and there's, a scene or a space that's meaningful to your characters. Um, Maybe you're writing poems and you've got kind of a space that's interesting to you. However you want to do it, pick a space that's interesting. And you can either use this literal form, or you can just kind of let the objects take the lead and just follow that. But however you do this, I want you to explore what information we learn about a place based on objects. It can be a list, it can be a poem, it can be whatever form. I just want you to follow those objects in the space. And think about what objects interest you, right? Because we could all describe the exact same room. Maybe we would all describe the abandoned farmhouse, and we would all hone in on different objects based on our special interests, based on our lived experience, based on what we care about and what we know, right? So think about what your character would know, what things would interest you in this space. And like I say, it could be any landscape, it can be one in your life, it can be one in story, but let those objects lead you. Okay, finish that last thought for now. If you enjoyed this exercise, you can always come back to it. You can always add more. But I'd love to invite you with this last bit of time if anyone would like to share anything they wrote or any observations or discoveries in that process.
I thought it was really neat to describe a place on our property, but I originally was going to write that there was an old road going through there, but I got totally hung up on this deep trough in the ground and how not to say it was a seasonal stream bed, but how to, say it. And the one line that I just loved, and it's got to go into a poem somewhere, was the branches had not merely fallen there, but had been tumbled, moved from their origin trees, some bound in the now dry dirt, others crammed together as if pushed there by an invisible hand.
Ooh, I
Isn't
love
that
that.
fun?
Yes. I love that
Um,
you took that challenge of like, how do I show this thing without saying it?
right. And I'm going to share it with my other writers group because this is cool.
Yay! Oh, I'm so glad. Great observation. Yeah, would anyone else like to share?
Karen's
Origin
still writing.
the original idea that I had was where I basically described something about an abandoned temple, and I described it that that it's ancient, that it's been around for a very long time. And I described it that way because that's how I would write something out.
Yeah. Well, and that setting is important, right? If you want something to convey that something's been around a long time, picking an ancient site, an ancient temple is like a really smart location for that content. So that's a great observation. Thank you, Princeton.
You could also say like the overgrowth of the leaves dated the ruins.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's something I love about ruins. It's a really great point. Um, how life overtakes and how that life can tell you a lot about how long it's been abandoned. It- because of how big something has grown. If a tree has grown through the middle of the floor and through the roof, that's going to tell you it's been abandoned a really, really long time versus, maybe if there's some vines that are just on the walls that are maybe, haven't gotten into the building yet or anything like that.
The overgrowth
Over the
proved that
summer,
it was a and winding, long and winding time since the temple has been populated by an ancient civilization. Very, with the overgrowth, the stakes were high. I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know, something about that.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about these kind of details is we can really zoom in so you can think about, what kind of overgrowth or how big, if those details help tell the story. So if you're thinking about time, how big is it? Where is it grown? Those things might be interesting details for your story potentially. Yeah, well, we've got a couple minutes left. So before I forget, it's on the handouts too, but I did put in the chat my website. So do feel free to stay in touch and learn more about my stuff, but also other webinars I do like this because I do webinars fairly often.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Meg, so much for doing this today. It was wonderful. As I said, I'm an avid gamer, so I always love when we talk about video games and storytelling and stuff. So that was great. I learned a lot of good stuff today. Now I want to go write. I want to go write after this.
Yay, that's the goal.
Yeah. So thanks again. The next things we have coming up are on Saturday, October 4th is our monthly chill and chat, just the informal session where people can just come and talk about what they're working on. It's more, that's just for our members to kind of just network or just really just kind of hang out. And then we have our October workshop is on Saturday, the 18th. And both of these are at 3 p.m. Pacific, by the way. And the 18th is story building for publication and production. It's going to be a panel on Zoom. We have 2 speakers lined up so far, I believe, and we're looking for a few more, but we will be making more announcements about that as we get closer. So, did I miss anything, Gwen?
No, you nailed it all.
I did.
Huge,
Okay, good.
huge
All right.
thanks to Meg. Thank you. This has been really insightful.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we'll do it again, I'm sure.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, stay in touch. Please do stay in
Wonderful.
touch.
All right.
Thank
So
you.
thank you everybody for being here, and hope you have a rest of your weekend is great. So.